All right, Brian, I think we're good if you want to kick us off.
Great. Thanks, Diego. Good afternoon. I'm Brian Trelstead, the faculty chair of the Advanced Leadership Initiative, and as the father of a non-binary child, a proud ally and supporter of the annual Pride Panel. This year, the Pride Panel was a collaboration among ALI's LGBTQ working group, the newly launched Carr Center for Global LGBTQ Human Rights, and the LGBTQ Health Center of Excellence, a joint venture between the Chan School of Public Health and the Pilgrim Harvard Institute of the Harvard Medical School that is set to launch tomorrow, June 4th. These three entities are all part of the kind of social change that we teach at the Advanced Leadership Initiative, an interfaculty initiative at Harvard about to launch our 16th cohort. We are focused on helping our fellows, like Mike Dillon, use a year at Harvard to launch a lifelong journey of learning and impact by researching, understanding, and then acting to solve important social and environmental problems during their third chapters. We are proud of the many ALI coalition members who are providing both leadership and financial support to these two new centers of change for LGBTQ health and human rights at Harvard. I'll now pass it back to you, Diego Garcia Blum at the Carr Center, who will introduce the panel and start our discussion.
Thank you, Brian. So my name is Diego Garcia Blum. I'm the new director of the Global LGBTQI Plus Human Rights Program at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School. And I'm very happy to have this be our first event for the program that we just launched. Just really quickly, this is a program that is focused on a global view of LGBTQ rights and advocacy around the world. We focus mostly on two things. The first is training advocates. So there is a wealth of knowledge on advocacy, organizing, human rights, and also the international system at Harvard that can be put to good use for LGBTQ advocates around the world. So we create programs where we train those advocates on that. We also allow the advocates to teach themselves. So we have a case study program where the advocates also create workshops to teach each other. And that way we create a community, a network of people who are constantly, learning, but also supporting each other. And then the second piece of our program is high impact research. We focus on three main kind of branches of the research. The first is undoing all the myths, misconceptions, and misunderstandings of LGBTQ people that are often used to justify horrible human rights abuses. So having a big Harvard approved and evidence-based research report on that goes a long way for advocates around the world. Also creating policy recommendations. Tim has been teaching a class on LGBTQ policy history for 5 years now. I've joined them for a few of those years on that. Usually the students do a very in-depth policy recommendations. So we're kind of gathering all the policy recommendations from over the years and making them available to policymakers. And lastly, too, there's places that just have not received LGBTQ any kind of advocacy for a long time because it's difficult. So we want to innovate on advocacy and kind of think about ways that messages and stories can get to those places so change can come there. So those are the main three areas of research. I'll pass it off to Mike Dillon, who, as we mentioned, is the kind of chair of the LGBTQ working group at the ALI initiative. And Mike has also been instrumental in getting the Health Center of Excellence started. So I'll have Mike say a few words about that.
Perfect. Thank you, Diego, and everyone. Happy Pride. We're thrilled to have this panel, given everything that's happening in the world, and especially at Harvard right now with the new Carr Center for Global LGBT Human Rights and what's happening at the Center of Excellence School of Public Health. I'm a 2020 ALI cohort member and also a 2023 MPH from the Harvard School of Public Health. Thank you for this opportunity to give a quick introduction of the LGBTQ Health Center of Excellence, which is a collaboration, as Brian had mentioned, between the Harvard School of Public Health and the Pilgrim Harvard affiliate of Harvard Medical School. This COE will actually be launched tomorrow at 4 o'clock on the campus of the School of Public Health, if anyone is available. This COE is under the leadership of Dr. Brittany Charlton, who could not be here for the first half of our discussion today, but we'll be here for the second half if there's any Q&A for her. This COE will be focused on three main tenets. First will be training and developing leaders within LGBTQ health through scholarship, through research and service fellowships. Secondly, it will be forming life-saving research. Three, it will be the dissemination of this research for forming public policy, supporting social acceptance of the LGBTQ community, and for fighting the negative political discourse that the community currently faces. As you'll hear about today from both Erin and from Tim, important to note, our service fellowships will be available across the universities for those students or prospective students attending today. We are very excited about this Center for Excellence, but we are just in the beginning of our development process for sustainability of this center. So please reach out to myself or Brittany for further discussion. And again, just thank you, panel, for what I know will be a very important conversation today. And now back to you, Diego. Thank you for this time.
Thanks, Mike. All right, so I'm going to pass it off to Erin and Tim to introduce themselves, and then we'll start with the first question. So Erin, if you want to go first.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. My name is Erin Reed. I am an independent journalist, contributor to The Guardian and a few other places as well, tracking LGBTQ legislation in the United States, writing about LGBTQ topics worldwide, especially transgender issues, as we see becoming ever more salient every day. I originally got started in this work tracking healthcare resources. So about 5 years ago, it was very hard to find an informed consent hormone therapy clinic for transgender people. All of these resources were scattered around the internet, and I gathered them together. I created a map, and that map has been used over 8 million times. Many trans people, if there are any in the audience right now, potentially have used that map, and I've been very happy I was able to contribute to that. I will also add, as an aside, my fiance, Representative Zoe Zephyr out of Montana. She's the first transgender representative of Montana. And she and I will be spending time in Harvard this summer. She is going to be attending the Harvard Kennedy School Senior Executives in State and Local Government program through the David Bennett Fellowship. So looking forward to it. Thank you, everybody, for having me on.
Thank you, Tim.
Erin, I did not know that. I'm so excited that you and Zoe are going to be here. We will have to make sure we convene and conspire while you're
Indeed
both here for sure. It's wonderful to be with all of you, Erin, specifically to be in this conversation. Diego, of course, in an ongoing way. You and I have been doing work together in this space for a very long time. And Mike, of course, likewise with you and your support for both the Center for Excellence at the Chan School and your support also for the Global LGBTQI plus Human Rights program at the Carr Center. You know, without people like you and you in particular in this space, we couldn't do what we do. So it's thrilling. That said, I'm Tim McCarthy, and I'm on the faculty at Harvard. I have a joint appointment at the Graduate School of Education and the Kennedy School of Government. As Diego mentioned, I will be I am, I guess now, the new faculty program chair of the new Global LGBTQI plus Human Rights program at the Carr Center. I taught at the Kennedy School as my principal place of employment for 17 years before moving and shifting my kind of home base to the Ed School, but I maintain an affiliation both with the Kennedy School and the Carr Center. I was the first openly gay and queer faculty member at the Kennedy School. That was a 21st century phenomenon. I'm not that old. I joined the faculty in 2006, 2007, and was the first and only for a number of years until we had more folks join us. That whole time I was at the Kennedy School, I was at the Carr Center and did a lot of work trying to push forward programming and research and teaching and other kinds of mentoring programs, training programs, et cetera, advocacy work, which was always an uphill battle. And so I'm thrilled that we are at this particular moment in history at the institution and in the world where these kinds of more institutionalized formations at different schools and these interdisciplinary and interschool initiatives are finally coming to fruition, along with the LGBTQ advocacy clinic that Alexander Chen directs at the law school. We have a really wonderful moment here, kind of zeitgeist, queer geist at Harvard, and that's just part of the story. But I'm very proud of that work. It was foundational work, but this feels like a moment of actual real liberation and relief and release, actually, for someone like me who's been here a long time. Next year will be my 25th year of teaching at Harvard, 30 years of teaching the academy. I'm a historian of social movements. I'll talk more about that as we go along. And as Diego mentioned, another just one piece that's important is that I taught the first and still only course in the Kennedy School's curriculum that is focused specifically on LGBTQ plus issues, focusing on the interrelationship between protest, politics, and policy. And I'll get into more about that as we go along. But that course was a first, and it's still the only. So I always say that because I keep pushing for more, and we'll hopefully get there in the near future. But that's a little bit about me. Thanks, Diego. Back to you.
Thanks, Tim. So actually, to start with you, as a historian of social movements, specifically the LGBTQ plus movement, how would you frame the current moment that we're living in historically? Have we seen this kind of pendulum swing from significant wins to being so under attack before? And if so, what key historical lessons and solutions can we draw from those moments?
Yeah. It's a great question, and it's a big question, and there are many ways to answer this. So let me just try a couple of points here. I think that when we're talking about a global movement, and we do, I think, now have to talk about a global movement because there is, for a whole variety of reasons that we know, more interconnection and interrelationship between LGBTQ folks who are working on the ground in all sorts of places across the globe. And that movement, though I think strikingly powerful in many ways, is also in some ways nascent as a global movement and is a patchwork, right? Different places have different challenges and different people doing the work in different ways. And so there's really no way to say this is what the movement is and who the movement is and what the movement's doing. It's very much a patchwork. And, Erin's point about the map that you've created, which is brilliant and so important to finding care and to understanding the expanding opportunities for folks, but also the threats to the people who are engaged in that work and who are seeking it and deserve it. There is always a patchwork, I think, whether you're talking about consent-informed care for transgender folks or you're talking about the kind of lived experience and the climate and culture of different places. That patchwork can be countries, that patchwork can be cultures, that patchwork can be states within a country like the United States. And so I think we need to be mindful that when we think about what a movement is, that movements are many things in many places with many peoples. I would say right now, if we think about the United States, we sort of zoom in on what's going on in the US, that we're in a both-and situation right now, that there have been some incredible victories and incredible leaps forward on a whole range of issues in terms of public policy. And legislation and laws and culture change over the course of even just the last 10 years, but certainly in the last generation and the last 50 to 75 years. And so we're looking at moments of change, and the movement has been very successful. And so we can look at different areas. We can look at marriage equality and see that there has been progress made. We can look at trans-inclusive healthcare. There's been some progress made, certainly lots of challenges there. When you think about the sort of representational inclusion in television and film and other kinds of cultural or creative projects, right? Enormous amount of progress in terms of that representation and visibility. And yet there are also lots of areas in which people are, like the incarceration, voting rights, right? Gender affirming care, these kinds of things. I mean, lots of ways in which there are still lots of things to do and lots of ways to go. That representational visibility that we see in the broader culture includes curriculum, includes books, includes other kinds of materials where LGBTQ folks are both the creative content creators, the distributors, producers, directors of those things, and also represented in them in various ways. And we see efforts to ban those kinds of things, particularly books, and to control curriculum, and the backlash that exists within our schools, right, is at a fever pitch right now. And so we're at a both-and moment. It's what I call in my work the paradox of progress, that every time you see a moment where we're moving forward, where you you can discernibly, right, empirically measure progress based on the number of people impacted by a law or a piece of public policy, or the number of people that are speaking in different ways and living in different ways and loving in different ways. Harder to measure, right, in that way. Those moments of progress, which are clear, and there are many of them to celebrate, are also moments, locations, where the pendulum swing of the backlash is almost always ready to go, right when the progress is achieved. I'll give you a couple of examples of that. One example, right, is that more recently in the marriage equality debate, we just celebrated the 20th anniversary of marriage equality in Massachusetts. The Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts legalized marriage equality, first state in the first country to do that. And we've celebrated 20 years of that victory just several weeks ago in May. That said, right after that ruling, right, which was the first in the United States, in 2004, there was a very intentional state-by-state attempt to put ballot initiatives on the ballot in states that were open to reversing that, to actually preventing that from happening in other states. They thought they were worried about a kind of cascade or a contagion of marriage equality. And so 22 states, I think 22 or 23, passed anti-marriage equality laws, constitutional amendments on the ballot in the popular election during George W. Bush and Dick Cheney's reelection, right, that defined marriages between a man and a woman. That was a backlash that was ready to go because it had already been there when the Massachusetts court ruled the way they did. And so that's just one example of many forms of backlash. You think about something that's a little bit more grandiose, the moment in the late 60s and 70s, which was really a decade of liberation, of gay and lesbian power, of protest and riots and political visibility and these kinds of things. There were all sorts of ways in which we can measure progress in the movement. Proliferation of LGBTQ groups, right? The first wave of elected officials in the 1960s, Harvey Milk being the kind of most spectacular. But we also, at that very same time, have Anita Bryant, who created a Save Our Children campaign to undo a statute in Miami-Dade County that would allow gay and lesbian teachers to teach openly in the schools. Right, an anti-discrimination bill that had been passed. She formed a movement that was a backlash to that progress, right, and then won the overturning of that anti-discrimination order. So there are all of these examples, but and if you think about the late 70s and then 80s going into the Reagan counter-revolution, right, that's all a backlash. That was a huge political and cultural backlash against the advances and the progress that had been clearly manifesting in the wake of Stonewall and the riots and protests that preceded Stonewall, and then the proliferation and acceleration of the liberation movement after that particular moment in June of 1969, which of course is what we use and focus on to celebrate Pride. I'll stop there and we can go into
that was amazing. I actually want to jump in a little bit because I want to hone in on a few
Yes,
things.
please.
The history there was incredible. And I love talking about LGBTQ history. I love talking about, reframing what we are seeing today and what we have seen in the past. And in so many cases, we do see borrowing of some of the same threads that continually appear whenever topics like this come up in American history. For instance, the drag bans that we see today, that we see everywhere, those same laws were used in the gay club raids of the 1950s and the 1960s. And in fact, we just saw the first person to be targeted by a drag ban in the United States in the current wave of drag bans was a transgender public speaker speaking about transgender history in a library in Montana. And, we see, for instance, whenever we hear about how trans people and queer people are increasingly visible, and people speak about the increasing visibility as a social contagion or like a spread of being trans or queer. You can go back and you can look at some of the articles written in the 1970s and 80s about how schools were being used to recruit gay people and how gay people could not reproduce. And so the only reason why we have gay people is because teachers are indoctrinating students into being gay. And you can even go all the way back to a completely separate controversy, which was back in the early 1900s with the rise of left-handedness, where you saw, and if you had done a survey In 1900, you would find that 3.5% of people were left-handed, and that number shot up to 12% by 1950. And it wasn't that we were suddenly catching left-handedness from one another. Rather, we started allowing left-handed desks, left-handed tools. We didn't beat it out of kids in their schools. I even did a little bit more research on this and found out there were actually little parents' rights groups over using your left hand in schools. So again, these things continually come forward. And even if you go all the way back to the 1920s and 30s with the Magnus Hirschfeld Institute of Sexology in Germany, this is the place where the first 30 years of research into trans and queer people were done in Germany. And it was the first place, whenever you see the books that are burning, it was the first place that they targeted. It was where they pulled all of those books from. Whenever you see those black and white pictures in your history books, it was of that institute. And the 8th edition of Der Stürmer magazine, the Nazi publication in Germany, featured a big picture of Magnus Hirschfeld, and it essentially called him a groomer. Again, these things continually do come back, and we are familiar with these backlashes. But I have to hope that the arc of the universe bends towards justice as long as we are here to go ahead and bend it.
Thank you both. And I think it's just always so important that we realize that these myths that are perpetuated often are recycled, but they have also been beaten over and over again to kind of have a sign of hope that things may look grim, but we have overcome similar turbulence in the past. So Erin, asking you more specifically about the moment that we're living in, this concerted attack on transgender people specifically, how do you think we got here? Because looking back at this intense period of backlash, it seems like around 2016 to 2018, a new movement was built from some think tanks and others, messaging and gender ideology. Was the LGBTQ movement slow to catch on and respond? What were the major LGBTQ organizations not doing or doing wrong? But what lessons can we learn from this moment so that we can, not be so caught off guard next time?
Yeah, this dovetails really well with our last question. And I want to highlight that whenever we got the Obergefell decision for gay marriage in 2015, the very next year we had the North Carolina bathroom ban. And so it's not like things stopped. It's not like that was the end. It's not like we got one Supreme Court decision and suddenly queer people had all the rights. Like, that's just not how it worked. And in fact, the people who were behind the opposition to gay marriage, they very quickly identified transgender issues as their next place where they could possibly get that pry bar underneath, because if they could get that leverage, they could then continue to overturn other rights that queer and trans people might want. And so what happened there, though, it was really interesting. In 2016, they went straight for bathrooms, and it was actually a poor decision on their part. It was a failure on their part, because even though they got that law passed, they weren't very tactical about it. They started too big. And in fact, we saw a major backlash in North Carolina. We saw PayPal pull out. We saw Deutsche Bank pull out. The public suddenly realized that there were more trans people than they had known about, and that trans people were everywhere around them. And really, at that moment, there was a huge push to repeal that law. By the time it was actually decided in court, it was settled in court, and they didn't even want to defend the law because it was that damaging. It potentially even swung the governor's election in North Carolina that year. And so I want to highlight that, because what we are seeing today, I truly believe we would have seen back then in 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. But they kind of licked to their wounds. And in fact, we see organizations like the Heritage Foundation, the Alliance Defending Freedom, the American Principles Project, Focus on the Family Policy Alliance, a lot of names all of you are likely very familiar with. They started planning. And in fact, there are email releases of where they were planning on how to do this. They wanted to start in Georgia and South Dakota. And then eventually they got the idea to go after sports. Sports was their way in. What they said was, if we could get you to accept an asterisk on somebody's gender identity in one area, in sports, then it's easier to sell you that everywhere else. It's easier to get you to move that asterisk to, and kids, and schools, and until eventually you're doing everything they wanted you to do anyway. You've got all the policies that they wanted you to pass anyway. In terms of the second part of your question, you asked about what we could be cognizant of right now that we may not have been like maybe some missteps in this current fight. And one of the biggest failures I see in this most recent fight is the failure to engage at the school board and local level early on. We saw Moms for Liberty had about 2 years head start on any major opposition from our LGBTQ organizations and leadership. And that was a major misstep, because once they started getting school policies passed in local school board elections, it then magnified into your larger elections. Thankfully, we have seen a regression on Moms for Liberty, and Moms for Liberty recently lost 70% of their races nationwide. But the damage is in many ways done in many of these states. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I feel like we actually have another example of where we are potentially not meeting the moment. And it's something that I have been pushing for. It's something that I pushed for today. And that is an international engagement on LGBTQ issues, and especially on transgender issues. Right now, you have organizations like GenSpect and SEGM, which are purposefully infiltrating major European healthcare institutions, that are infiltrating organizations like the World Health Organization, that have people in the United Nations that are now trying to push for global anti-LGBTQ policies. And I will remind everybody here that even if you don't have much of an interest in what is happening abroad, these same policies, the moment they are passed in places like the United Kingdom or in Sweden, they are then cited in court decisions in the United States to draw down on policies here at home. And the funding source for these organizations is Koch brothers' money. We've already had a Southern Poverty Law Center investigation into where these funding sources are coming from. And this is all coming from the same funding sources that we are seeing that target abortion, for instance, that target reproductive health care, and that even target gay people in places like Uganda. And so this is a major issue that I think we need to step forward on, is international engagement.
Perfect. Tim, I'll pass it on to you as the faculty chair of the Global LGBTQ Rights Program.
Erin, you're connecting so many important dots between the past and the present, between what's happening in the US, what's happening abroad, and then what comes back to the United States, right? There's always this kind of the ping pong that goes on. I always talk about in my course, I talk about, it's not homosexuality that we've exported from the United States to places like Uganda. It's homophobia that we've, and Christian infused, right? Evangelical Christian laden homophobia that ends up being, I mean, there are Ugandan queers that have always been in existence, and we know that because we know many of them, and they've always been there. But it's this infrastructure of homophobia and transphobia and biphobia, and these attacks on folks using, as Diego and Erin have both said, these ancient prejudices and stigmas and discourses to do very modern forms of injustice. And so you're connecting all these great dots. And a couple of things I wanted to pick up on that I think that you said that I want to maybe add to and certainly amplify and align with. One is that the way in which the North Carolina ban, the trans ban bathroom bill, right, or whatever they called it, came right after Obergefell, right? That this is a really important thing, because the backlash is not always point for point or people for people. Sometimes the backlash is against a more vulnerable or perceived to be more vulnerable or less expansive population of people, right? So Obergefell represented a decades-long attempt and prioritization of marriage equality within the movement, which had lawyers and it had resources and it had all sorts of stuff. It took many, many years to do. I don't want to downplay the significance of marriage equality for all sorts of reasons. However, right, that was a win, right? And that wasn't a win that was going to go away. That was a Supreme Court ruling. Supreme Court rulings don't get overturned in 6 months, right? It takes, as we have seen with the Dobbs decision, sometimes it takes 50 years to overturn a Supreme Court ruling, right? That's a slower process. But what can happen as a backlash to marriage equality for a certain segment of the queer population, right? A backlash where these anti-trans bills and these so-called bathroom bills and these book banning bills are popping up in state and, absolutely right, Lauren, local jurisdictions, right? So we can't win at the Supreme Court on marriage equality. We got our ass kicked there. Pardon my McCarthy. I don't say French. I say McCarthy. We got, that was a win, and that was a decisive win and an enduring one for the time being, notwithstanding Clarence Thomas's point in the Dobbs decision about going after Obergefell and other rulings. But now they've pivoted and they've moved to state levels and states where there is great fertile ground, places like Florida, Tennessee, North Carolina, et cetera, right? Places where there's fertile ground for these bills and proposed legislation that are attacking more vulnerable populations within the LGBTQ community. And I think that's really, really important, that sometimes the backlash pivots, right, to the location and to the population that is being targeted. And I think that that's really, it's incredibly important to think about that. Another point I wanted to make, because I think it's really important, is that I think, and I you know, I've been around the block and back several times, and so I've talked to lots of people, and I've been a culture warrior for about as long as I can remember, and I've forgotten some of the battles. But one of the things that is very clear to me is that there is, I think, in some quarters, a kind of a sense that trans issues are new, or that transgender people are new, and that this is either a phase, or it's fashionable, or it's a brand new thing in the world. None of those things are true. And I want to be really clear about that, because we see, you talked about Magnus Hirschfeld's research, right? We can go back to the ancient times to think about people who defied gender norms, right? Who defied ideas about what it means to be a man and a woman, or what it means to be married, or what it means to be in love or in a sexual relationship with people who are attracted to be. Right? You can see all the, my dear friend Jen Mannion wrote a book called Female Husbands, where Jen tracked the history of this type of person, female husbands that were transing history and transing gender in real time in the UK and the United States, going back to the 18th century all the way on through to the early 20th century and to the present day. Right? When you think about the drag balls in Harlem, right, during the Harlem Renaissance, during the 20s and 30s, you think about all of these ways. Think about wars in the United States. Oftentimes women were not able to fight on the front lines of battle, and so often dressed as men and performed military service as male soldiers in every war, starting with the American Revolution, the War of 1812, right, the Civil War, all the way on down. And so one of the things that I think is really important is that transgender folks and folks who have transgender historically have always been part of history. Whether they have been recognized in the historical record and the writing of history is another question, right? They've always existed, not always recognized. And so I think that that's a failure of historians. That's a failure of popular imaginations of historical memory, right? To think that this is somehow new in the world. There are very modern and contemporary challenges that are specific to this time, right? But to Erin's point, the echoes throughout history are very real, right? And the essence of people's lived experiences throughout history. And so I think we need to not, within the movement, sort of focus on what's new and what's not, but to think about what is ancient is now modern, right? And who has been there all along? And to the last point I want to make about this, which gets at something I think, Diego, you'll probably mention later on, is that there have been, in any movement, in any organization, at any time, there are priorities, right? There are people and issues that are lifted up, and people and issues that are marginalized, decentered, or left behind. In my Queer Nation course, what I'm constantly asking from the very first day to the very end of the class, who is left out and who is left behind? What are we not doing? And what did we not do at any given moment in the history of our movement, right? And I think one of the things that's happening now is that the transgender population, right, within the larger queer community, right, is more vocal, visible, organized, powerful, right, than we've ever seen before. And so some of this backlash is not just about trans people of color in particular, being more vulnerable within the larger social, economic, cultural, political system, but also more powerful in their assertion of a citizenship and of a whole cohort of rights, not just the right to vote or the right to have health care, the right to these kinds of things, all of which are important, but the right to exist, the right to be recognized, the right to live and love and frolic and play and organize and do all of the things, right, that any human being deserves to have the right to do. And so I think that's also something that's happening now, and it's particularly powerful, I think, within the trans community, which is why those of us who are not self-identified as trans should have always been listening to trans people, and certainly now need to listen very carefully and follow the lead.
It reminds me of something that we teach in Queer Nation, with Emperor Elagabalus, who is one of the Roman emperors in time that presents many times as female, also was asked to be called lady. And now it's a political statement to say that they were perhaps trans. And there is actually a museum that is listing them as female. And so, it just makes you think about all the times that queer history has been erased. And so it makes it seem like trans people and LGBTQ people overall have not been part of it when in fact they have. And so, and also just wanted to touch on Erin's point that things that are being invested in by the anti-movement in the United States, especially the gender ideology movement, is showing up all over Europe now. And it draws strength from when it gets in power in different countries. And now we see it in Hungary, we see Trump meeting with Viktor Orban. And so it starts growing, and it's something that we need to pay attention to. So moving on to looking more positive, and Erin, I want to start with you. Recently, what are some specific maybe court rulings or political developments or grassroots efforts that you draw hope from or that stand out to you as sources of momentum? And what do you think could be also some promising avenues for policy change and social progress?
I like this question because I think that having hope is really important. Hope is sort of the fuel that we've earned to keep us going, I think that the young people get it. I really do. I think that the young people, Gen Z, millennials, they get it, and in a way that that many people who are older will have to come to terms with as we progress as a society. And in fact, last year, the Trans Day of Visibility marches were led by Queer Youth Assemble, all queer organizers under the age of 26 years old, and they were the biggest Trans Day of Visibility marches in history. We see time and time again that young people right now are stepping up in this moment. In Virginia, whenever Glenn Youngkin's policies banning trans people from bathrooms in schools and banning sports and more, we saw mass student walkouts. Tens of thousands of students in Virginia walked out of their schools. We've seen similar in Florida, where they just essentially chased a trans girl out of the state because she was playing volleyball, and all of her friends knew her as who she was. And so the administration chased a trans kid out of the state, but all of her peers, all of her teammates stood up for her. And I think that that's another thing that I want to mention, is that as bad as the laws are right now, and as scary as they are, I'm not seeing, and I keep looking for it, and I'm not finding it. I'm not finding that this is a popular movement. This is not like the anti-trans movement. I'm not seeing that this is some sort of a groundswell of hate towards trans people. I'll give you a really good example. In Florida, they passed the bathroom ban. It's a criminal bathroom ban. You can be arrested and put in jail for up to a year. And it is a very harsh one, and it's a scary one. But you know how many people so far have been arrested under that law? We haven't had one yet. And there's a reason why. It's not because the law isn't as bad as they say it is. And it's also not because trans people are not using the bathroom, although that is part of it. Trans people are self-policing. But it's also because they cannot find anybody who wants to enforce it. They can't find people to report other trans people. In fact, in the state colleges in Florida, the DeSantis administration learned that none of the administrators were enforcing the law. They had no way to enforce it. They didn't want to enforce it. And so he's trying to now change the bylaws of the Florida college system to mandate that you enforce the law and search for trans people, or you could be kicked out. In Utah, they just had a forum that they released where you could report trans people that you encounter in bathrooms online on this digital forum. And instead of getting actual reports, they got 10,000 meme messages with the script to the Bee movie and Godzilla holding a trans pride flag. Like, we see this time and time again, that this is not a popular movement. And in fact, there was a Fox News poll a year and a half ago that asked you to list all of the issues that you care about. And in very last place was transgender/woke issues, because they had to combine the two because neither of them had enough people to answer this being their primary issue. We continually see elections lost on this issue. We saw in Kentucky, Governor Andy Beshear, they ran very hard against him. They said that his veto of a gender-affirming care ban in Kentucky would doom his reelection. He's a Democratic governor in a very Republican state. And they ran millions of dollars in anti-trans ads on him. He won by more points than he won with his first campaign. I could go on and on this particular topic. The other thing that I'll say that gives me hope, going back to young people, is I got a phone call about a year and a half ago from a transgender girl in Louisiana. I am from Louisiana. I'm from South Louisiana. And 20 years ago, I grew up there and it was hard. I was bullied relentlessly as a young queer kid. And it was very hard to come out. I couldn't fully be myself as a trans kid in South Louisiana 20 years ago. But I got this call and she said, "Hey, Erin, I love your work. I'm from," and she named a school that was only 15 minutes from where I grew up. And she said, "And I just wanted to let you know that I was nominated to the homecoming court." And I cried because that's how things change. That is what gives me hope. If I remember how bad this place was for me, and to see now that there's a trans girl that's not just being accepted, but celebrated and loved by her peers in the same sort of school that I went to. There's pictures of her dad driving her around the football stadium and she's waving at everybody. Whatever the laws do, as bad as they might get, that's the future. And I think that the future does look good to me.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that, Erin. Those stories are what give me hope, right? All of that is, and we have to tell them and we have to share them, obviously getting consent from the people we're talking about if we're sharing other people's stories. But this idea that like we're constantly under siege and things are dire and desperate and terrible. I mean, there's truth there for sure. These laws are draconian. They're based on ancient prejudices and stigmas and misunderstandings, right? All of those things are true. And we're winning. We are winning. And I keep saying that, and this isn't a kind of queer Ted Lasso moment, right? We are winning. We have posted more victories as a movement in the last 20 years than I think you'd be hard pressed to find another major social movement that has posted more wins. And I'm talking culture change wins, cultural representation wins, social policy, law changes, right? The Democratic Party, now one of our major political parties, in my opinion, the only one with any like reasonable claim to sanity, right, is fully LGBTQ, right? Erin, you went to a Department of Health and Human Services Pride function today. I'm going to go to one in Washington if my leg is fine in a couple of weeks, right? Like the Democratic Party is flawed, and I have lots of critiques, and that's a whole nother webinar, right? But the fact of the matter is, when I first started doing activism as a young person after coming out, right, you couldn't rely on anybody. Right, you couldn't rely on anybody. It wasn't until Obama's administration and Biden as the vice president where there was real inclusion or at least tolerance within the Democratic Party for that. That's not insignificant when it comes to policy, right? And when it comes to like having connections to people who are policymakers, that's important. We have the best lawyers in the game, period, full stop, next slide, right? We have lots of resources. Do they need to be distributed more equitably? Do they need to be shared more fully? Of course, absolutely. And that's a very important part of this as well. But we're winning. And to Erin's point about the bill in Florida, that nobody wants to enforce this. Right? Remember when people were going to protest giving married, couples, wedding cakes, right, or wedding certificates at a town hall, right? You have the outliers, these crazy people who won't do that, right? The homophobic bakers, like fine, whatever. And there's a Supreme Court case on this. We get it. But the fact of the matter is, there are a lot more wedding cakes that are fabulously made and eaten, right, all across this country now than there ever have been before. Just a small data point, but one that I think is important. We just went through commencement, and this has been a tough year on campus in many ways for all sorts of reasons around the war in Gaza and tensions over Israel and Palestine. In our own university at Harvard, we had a coup that deposed our first Black woman president. We have a leadership crisis. We have all sorts of things that are going on that made this year quite unpleasant on campus and in the world. And yet, 2 days before our commencement, which had a walkout, right, on the issue of Gaza and Palestine, right, I was at the Lavender graduation. Diego, you were there. And I sat on stage as one of the 3 chosen faculty stole presenters and presented rainbow stoles to 300 graduates from across the university who had chosen to come to this ceremony that we now host for queer identified students and their families to come, and we had a drag performance, and we danced, and we celebrated, and we sang, and we gave out 300 stoles, and the faculty were there, and the staff were there, and it was a celebration. And it was a celebration of abundant queer joy. When I graduated from Harvard 31 years ago now, as a senior in college, we were protesting the ban on gays and lesbians in the military, and we were protesting Colin Powell's speech where he was going to announce the progress policy of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And we had lift the ban buttons and red triangles on our mortarboard, which come from the Holocaust, and then ACT UP activism around the AIDS crisis, right? And I was in the closet. I had a shirt that said, straight but not narrow. I wore an Ally shirt 31 years ago. I was in an Ally shirt, straight but not narrow, protesting the ban on homosexuals in the military. There was no lavender graduation. There were, I think, 3 members of my class who were courageous enough to be out in 1989, right? We just had our 30th reunion. We got dozens and dozens of queers all laughing about how closeted we used to be. And just that data point, a very personal one, right? In terms of protest and policy change and personal lived experience, right? There's been huge process. So I just think it's hard to look back. I'm 53 next week, right? Hard to look back and not acknowledge that the arc of history is bending towards justice, and we are winning more than we are losing in significant ways. And the last point I want to make is that I spend my life, the one thing that got me through this year on campus, hardest year of my teaching career, is my students. And Queer Nation in particular, the students who take that class, so diverse from all over the world, right? Identifying in all sorts of different ways, who are teaching me so much about what it means to live in this world, in this way, in this time, and to have hope, and to be fierce and fabulous at the same time in a way that I did not have the courage to be when I was their age. But thank God I get to be with them as a matter of daily practice in my job. Because there's never going to come a time where I'm going to be pessimistic and cynical, right? As long as young people exist and are willing to do the work that they've inherited and take the torch that we are passing them, and to learn from the past, both the successes and the failures, and to push the elders into a new place for a new renewed movement and a reimagining of what liberation could look like for all of us. Like that to me, I'm fired up about that. And I think we all should be.
Amazing. Well, let's open up now for any questions in the audience. Because the last question was about young people, but you all kind of weaved it into the other ones.
Yay, young people.
Danson, I'm gonna bring you in. Go ahead.
Oh, hi, Diego. Thank you so much for this amazing panel. I'm traveling. I'm in a bus, so I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you just fine.
All
We
right,
can hear you
thank
great.
All right, thank you so much. I think this has been very illuminating, and I've loved everything that you people have said. I've loved the sharing of experiences. I've also loved the comment on Uganda that the homophobia we see in the country is not just the making of the country, but it has a lot of transnational forces, including funding from the US and so on. I would like to ask the panelists to share what they think about the intersections between homophobia, transphobia, and other phobias like Islamophobia, Afrophobia, and so on. What intersections do you see among these phobias from the vantage points of your work? Thank you so much.
There are so many intersections. I'll jump in really quickly just to highlight a couple things. The first thing that I will say is, they just had a major court decision in Uganda about the anti-gay laws there, and in that court decision, they cited the Dobbs decision, and what they specifically cited was the Glucksberg test in the Dobbs decision. The idea that a right is not a right unless it is deeply rooted in this nation's history and traditions. That's the phrase from the Glucksberg test. That's the phrase from the Dobbs decision. And in fact, what they used from that was they said, well, look, even America understands that we really should be doing what was traditional and what was actually a long time ago in this country. And these newfangled ideas of acceptance are bad, and that they undermine our traditions. And that was how it was cited. And we see the disparate impact that this decision has on minorities, on many different minorities. And in fact, one thing that I was able to witness in Montana, whenever my fiance, Representative Zoe Zephyr, was silenced on the House floor and was barred from representing her constituents simply for speaking out in favor of or against an anti-trans law there. The first person to stand up to her defense was Representative Wendy Boy from the American Indian Caucus, who specifically said, I recognize what's going on here. I see what's going on here. You're silencing somebody, you're stopping them from speaking, and you're going to use the same things that you're using against her whenever it comes against us, whenever we're trying to stand up for, our tribal leaders and all of our traditions. And so we do see this sort of intersectionality come up time and time again. And in fact, in 1990, I'm going to talk about another area of intersectionality. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And in order to pass that act, disability rights activists moved with LGBTQ activists. There's this newspaper clipping that I like to show whenever I present on trans history topics that shows disabled advocates hold historic Pride Day. And it was like this massive dual activism / pride event where you had people who were fighting for disabled people and people who were fighting for queer people all together, fighting together and celebrating together. And in fact, after that bill was passed, after the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, 30 years later, we now just get a ruling out of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals that says that the ADA protects gender dysphoria and protects transgender people, which is a whole new avenue to challenge anti-trans laws. So whenever we talk about the importance of intersectionality, what comes around goes around. Like the Dobbs decision ends up finding its way into Uganda and being targeted towards people being weaponized by Christian nationalists from the United States. You have your disability activism ends up coming back to help trans and queer people in the future. I think that it's really important to recognize that.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to take this up in just a bit of a different angle, co-signing on everything Erin just said. But Danson, one of the things that I think is that you see playing out, place like Uganda is a perfect example, but there are other countries as well. There are dozens of countries around the globe that have incredibly draconian laws that initially were anti-sodomy laws or something like the sort of anti-gay sex laws that were part of a mostly British colonial and imperial project. That the laws that currently exist, like the so-called Kill the Gays bill in Uganda and others, are laws that have that are built on the vestiges of these colonial statutes that still exist in dozens of countries throughout the globe. And actually, where the most draconian laws are, there are these deep colonial and imperial histories that still have legacies within the law and within policy and practice and cultural protocols in countries where you're seeing a rise of homophobia and transphobia and these kinds of things, and a backlash against or open hostility to the LGBTQ community. And so I think that we have to contend with the way in which the colonial and imperial project was itself deeply racist, deeply Islamophobic, deeply hostile to Africans, right, as an uncivilized peoples, right, which is, of course, an absurd claim on a million levels, right, and that the intersections of those kinds of prejudices and discriminations, right, for people who are other, right, who are, Edward Said talked about Orientalism, right? The construction, regardless of where you are within the colonial and imperial project, of an other, usually an uncivilized other that has a different kind of religious and cultural sort of set of traditions, right? And so all of that gets wrapped up in this project of imposing homophobia on places in the global south from the global north and what was previously referred to as the sort of west. And I think that's really, really important to understand the intersections of those histories, right? And the legacies of racism and imperialism and colonialism and these kinds of things on the current efforts, right, to attack LGBTQ folks. And I think that's important. The other thing, too, with respect to white evangelicals in the United States who are going to places like Uganda, right, to do that work, right? There's also a deeply paternalistic racism, right, that comes from people who think that their like God-given sort of charge in the world is to go to the dark continent, and I'm using these racist terms that still have resonance in some people's minds, right? That they think that like this is their way to go help those people, right? It's all wrapped up in the same kind of discourse and so forth. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand is while these people in the courts and in other places are talking about traditions, right? Traditional marriage and traditional gender identities and traditional this, that, or the other thing, right? Prejudice and discrimination are also traditions deeply rooted, right, in the laws and policies and statutes and cultural practices of places that have power. And so we have to fight back on that level too, to say, look, there is power in exposing the fact that prejudice and discrimination are also part of the tradition that these people seem to be claiming.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, well, I think we have time for one more question. Nell.
Hi, hello, Diego. Thank you so much for this session. It's really enlightening and insightful. Erin and Timothy, thank you for your insight. It's been a lot, and I've learned a lot. So I just want to ask a question, and I'm going to draw some instance from what is happening currently now. Excuse me, what is happening currently now in the global north. And as an activist or an advocate in West Africa, in Nigeria, and we do understand how complex and dynamic our situation is here to advocate for LGBTQ plus equality. Although there have been some improvement. Opinion polls from last year is showing that there's a 12% increase in Nigerians who think that the law that criminalizes same-sex union should be decriminalized. And judging from that, it means that we have a brilliant future ahead of us. If we keep up this pace, it means in 10, 20 years, we'll have a majority of Nigerians on the side of decriminalization, which is a good thing. But I do not want us to, have this challenge, for a lack of better word, that is currently happening now in the global north, in the rise of anti-trans movement and transphobia in the global north. We are seeing countries like the UK, the US, and I think even to some extent Canada passing policies that are deemed transphobic. And these are countries that have inclusive marriage equality laws and laws that protect LGBTQ persons from discrimination. We in Nigeria, we have laws that criminalizes such unions or identity, and we want to advocate for decriminalization. So how do we do this in a way that is inclusive of gender diversity and the trans community, in a way that we are advocating for decriminalization of our identities, but also we are seeking for more greater protection to include gender diverse and trans people. We don't want to come back in 50 years' time after we must have won decriminalization to start talking again about anti-trans or anti-gender movement. I don't know if you get my question.
Yeah, I think we have a few minutes to get kind of maybe a closing answer on that.
Timothy, would you like to take this one?
You want? I can take a gander at it. You raise a set of important points here. One is sort of how do you create you're in a different situation in terms of the public opinion is starting to shift. That's the first thing you said, was the public opinion is starting to shift, and that sometimes comes before the laws change and the policies change. Sometimes they come afterwards, right? And so thinking about the dynamics of a particular kind of political culture, I think is really important, right? Like, you know, in the United States, there was a huge shift after marriage equality was legalized, right? After the Obergefell, the Supreme Court ruling came, huge shift. It used to be 70-30 against, now it's 70-34 in the United States. And a lot of that has moved after 2015. But there are lots of other examples throughout history where the sort of culture change precedes the policy and the legal change. And so I think if you see these shifts, figuring out where those shifts are located. Is it, my suspicion would be maybe young people, maybe people who are less inclined to be fervently religious in one way or the other. We know that there's a correlation, sometimes even a causation, between sort of devout religious faith or not and acceptance of LGBTQ people and other issues. And so thinking about, like, is that public opinion shift because young people are waking up and claiming power? If that's the case, then I think doing organizing work in those communities, I think, is really, really important. But the other question you ask, which I think is really important as well, is this inclusion piece. Like, how do you include an expansive idea of identity when it comes to sexual and gender identities in the organizing effort and in the fight for decriminalization, so that when decriminalization comes, it doesn't just come for gay people, lesbian people, bisexual people, right? It comes for people who are trans and non-binary, and so it's more inclusive of language that contains both sexuality and gender, so that you don't have to add gender after you get sexuality, if you get what I'm saying. So I think thinking about that, this is where I think some of the movements that are emerging, right, for decriminalization or what have you, have a lot can learn from the limitations and the mistakes that, say, we've made here in the United States and in other parts of the global North. I think there are lots of lessons to be learned from the mistakes that we've made, right, that can lead to a more inclusive kind of organizing effort and the language that attends those organizing efforts. So that's what I would say. Erin, you can have last.
Yeah, no, that was great. That was incredible.
All right. Well, thank you both and everyone who also asked questions for participating. And it was a pleasure to have you all. Please go to the Carr Center website and sign up for our newsletter to be up to date with what we're doing. Our application for our 2021 International LGBTQ Activism Summit is out until June 21st, and also our online program. And we'll be deep diving into questions like this with folks all around the world. So incredibly thankful for everyone that came today, and I hope that you enjoyed the conversation.